Hello and welcome to Chapter 20, the Cardiovascular System. This is Ms. Hook, and this chapter we're going to look at the different components of the cardiovascular system. We're going to look at the heart anatomy and the physiology of it. Okay. So first let's talk about the microscopic view. If you're viewing your PowerPoint, you can click on that animation to go through it in more detail. So microscopic, looking at a microscope, looking at the cardiac muscle tissue. So remember, they're a little bit different than like skeletal muscle tissue. Cardiac muscle cells are connected to each other. They're short, they branch, but they are striated. They're striped. You can see their contractile proteins patterns. Their mitochondria are very large and they take up a lot of the cell. The reason that they have so many is because they have to be constantly replenishing ATP, making more energy so they can keep contracting. And whereas skeletal muscle fibers or cells are long, they go the whole length of your skeletal muscle. Cardiac muscle fibers are short and interconnected. So here's a view showing the similarities between cardiac and skeletal muscle tissue. On the outside, you've got the sarcolemma, same as skeletal muscle. You've got these large mitochondria, transverse tubules to send the signal across the cell quickly. The sarcoplasmic reticulum or endoplasmic reticulum that releases calcium every time the muscle contracts, so that actin can bind to myosin. They've got the same striation structure, the repeating pattern of sarcomere down the whole cell. And you can see when their cell junctions together, they have these really dark portions called intercalated discs. So those are where two cells connect. And you've got two types of junctions there. You've got desmosomes. They're like these anchoring proteins. So if you and I were holding hands, we'd be able to like stay connected, but we could also move quite freely. We wouldn't tear if we contracted. And then gap junctions are these holes that allow ions to flow straight from cell to cell. And that's going to be important for how they conduct electrical signal. Our signal to contract the cell is going to start in the right atrium, and it's going to spread to all the cells in the atria through these gap junctions really quickly. So here's an intercalated disc. They appear darker. You can see the desmosomes on anchoring points connecting them, and then the gap junctions allowing ions to travel through to send electrical signals. So to remember the differences between skeletal and cardiac muscle, skeletal muscle fibers are independent. They get their information straight from the nervous system, whereas cardiac interlock and they're sending signals to each other. There are larger mitochondria in cardiac cells. Skeletal muscle cells have lots of nuclei, whereas cardiac muscle cells only have 1 to 2. And the skeletal muscle fibers, they have a nerve that tells them when to fire, whereas cardiac cells have automaticity. They're self-run. They have their self-rhythm. Auto is self. So they're depolarizing, repolarizing on their own and sending that signal to the rest of the heart. And when the cells get that signal, they contract. Now let's go to macroscopic anatomy, large scale. The size of your heart is about the size of your fist, and it's located in the mediastinum within the thoracic cavity and then inside the pericardial cavity. And it goes from about your second rib to your fifth. And it sits on top of the diaphragm, and it's 2/3 to the left. So it goes through the middle behind your sternum, but 2/3 is on the left, 1/3 on the right. In the front, you've got the sternum. In the back, you've got the vertebral column. And surrounding the heart, you've got the pericardium, this serous membrane with a fibrous portion on the outside to protect the heart, keep it in place, and reduce friction. So there you go. There's a picture. And here you can see the mediastinum, part of the thoracic cavity. Diaphragm on the bottom, pericardial portion here. So if you remember serous membranes, there are 2 layers. There's an outer layer of membrane, a layer of cells that are closer to the cavity wall called the parietal layer, and the visceral layer which also has a special name for the heart, is the epicardium, is touching the organ, the viscera. So visceral, right next to the heart, serous fluid in the middle, and then the parietal layer on the outside. That pericardium is going to help reduce friction. The serous fluid is going to lubricate the area so the heart can move more freely, not rub against the cavity wall. Outside of that, you've also got this superficial fibrous pericardium. So it's very fatty, very tough. When you dissect hearts, you'll be able to feel how tough it is, connective tissue there. It helps protect the heart, anchor it in place, and then it also keeps it from overfilling. If it gets too stretched, it can't make the right connections between the actin and the myosin to contract. Now let's look at the layers of the heart wall. There are 3 layers that are called heart wall, and the first layer is actually the epicardium, that visceral layer of the serous membrane. So you've got fibrous pericardium on the outside, parietal pericardium, serous fluid, and then the inner layer of the serous membrane is that outer layer of the heart. That's the epicardium. Epi above, it's the first layer around the heart. Next, the thickest layer is your myocardium, myomuscle. So this is the cardiac muscle tissue. And the inner layer is the endocardium. Endo inner, it's a smooth layer of cells that are the same as the inner layer of your vessel walls. It's very smooth, it helps reduce friction, move blood through more easily. You've also got what's called the fibrous skeleton. So the best view to see that is if you make this nice transverse cut, and you'll see wrapping around the valves of the heart is this connective tissue layer. So these are the valves between the top atrium of the heart and the bottom ventricle. So it helps divide the top half of the heart from the bottom. That's going to be really important because it acts as an insulator. So the electrical signal can't go from some cardiac muscle cells on the top part of the heart to the bottom through this space. So it helps insulate it so we can send it the correct way and our heart contracts properly. They help our valves stay anchored, they protect them, they keep them from overstretching as well. Okay, so I would pause the video, review the layers of the heart wall here until you're inside the heart. Once you've got the layers of the heart down, we're going to go through the rest of the features of the heart. Your heart has 4 chambers. It's us, birds, crocodiles, alligators that have 4-chambered hearts. They have 2 atria, these 2 chambers on the top, and 2 ventricles on the bottom. And basically the right side of your heart pumps one way, and your left side pumps another. So your right side pumps the lungs, where the blood picks up oxygen, then it comes back around to the left side, pumps out to the body. We'll get more into that later, but it's a good idea to kind of have a basic overview before we get too into this. Okay, so the top 2 small chambers are the atria. Atria is plural, atrium is singular. And dividing these 2 chambers, these 2 spaces, is a wall of cardiac muscle. That's called the interatrial septum, the divider between the atria. And outside your heart, you have these external auricles. Those are the shoulder pads. So you can see a bit of an auricle here. There's the left auricle there. And remember, when we're looking at the heart, the patient's right, the patient's left. It's always based on the patient. Okay. So in your atria, those walls are ridged by pectinate muscles. Pectinate has to do with like a rooster. So think of a rooster pecking. It has these portions in there. You can see the pectinate muscles right here. They kind of look like veins in the atrial wall. And then the vessels entering your right atrium are all the areas that have deoxygenated blood. Because remember, your right side is going to pump to the lungs. So everything that needs to pick up oxygen goes to the right side. So from your body, you've got the superior and inferior vena cava, and then the coronary sinus. So that's going to be the set of vessels that go and give your heart muscle oxygen. And then they come back through the back of the heart area into the right atrium. And then on the left atrium, you're going to have all the vessels coming in from the lungs to the left side. So that's your pulmonary veins. Arteries go away from the heart, veins come into the heart. So the pulmonary veins are the vessels that go from the lungs into the heart. And this blood is oxygenated. So the right side deoxygenated going to the lungs. Left side oxygenated, getting ready to be pumped out to the body. Okay. So there's the auricles, and the atria are right underneath. Below the atria, you've got ventricles. So the right atria, blood flows from there into the right ventricle. On the left side, blood goes from the left atrium to the left ventricle. And between the two, you've got the interventricular septum. Between ventricular ventricles, septum divider. And if you look, you can see a physical difference between the two sides. Your right side is much thinner, your left side cardiac muscle wall is much thicker. And that makes a lot of sense. Your right side is going to be pumping to the lungs. The lungs are in the thoracic cavity, they don't have to pump blood very far. Whereas your left side has to pump blood to the whole body, so it's going to be pumping a lot farther. So it has to be stronger, contract more. So here's another view. I always say during dissections, if you're not sure if you're oriented properly, if you cut into the ventricles, you'll be able to tell where you're at, because the left side's going to be thicker. There are different names for the muscle of the ventricles compared to the atria. In the atria, we have the pectinate muscles. In the ventricles, you've got two different types. You've got the trabeculae carnae. Trabeculae means beams, B-E-A-M-S. Carne means meat. So these are the meaty beams. Papillary muscles, papillary is a bud, so like your taste buds are your papillae. These bud out, and they're going to connect to your valves there. Okay. So on the right side, going to the lungs, leaving, the right ventricle has the pulmonary trunk, and that's going to turn into the pulmonary arteries and go to the lungs. The left side, going out to the body, all the blood going out to your body through the left ventricle goes through the aorta. Okay, so you can find the ventricles by looking at this fat-filled groove. This groove on the front is called the anterior, because it's on the front, interventricular, between the ventricles, sulcus, or groove. So here's the right ventricle, there's the left ventricle. Cutting open the heart through a frontal plane, you can see the different chambers really nicely. Right atrium, right ventricle, left ventricle. And you can see these muscles in the back. Those are the trabeculae carnae. Those are the meaty beams. And then these buds connecting to the valve, those are the papillary muscles. They're going to be connected to your heartstrings, your chordae tendineae. Look at those later. That connect to your cuspids, your valves here. Okay. So why do we have valves? Valves ensure unidirectional blood flow. They keep blood flowing forwards. They prevent backflow. Super important to have valves so that we have things going the proper way. Otherwise, the heart wouldn't be very efficient at all. You have two sets of valves. The first set are your AV valves, your atrioventricular valves, also called your cuspids. You've got one on the right side dividing the right atrium from the right ventricle, and the left side dividing the left atrium from the left ventricle. They can also be called your cuspids because they're basically these cusps with the chordae tendineae, your heartstrings, connecting to the papillary muscles. On your right side, you've got the tricuspid. On your left side, you've got your bicuspid or mitral valve. So you can see when the atria are contracted and the ventricles are filling, they're open. And then when the ventricles contract and we want to send blood out into the arteries, they're closed.